The New York Mets were arguably the most active team in Major League Baseball this offseason, but how much better did they get? On the show today, I'm grading every move that they made, and we're going to discuss how much better they truly got.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to be grading the Mets off season. The first segment, I'll talk about the first few moves that they made, the trade of Brandon Nimmo, the signing of Devin Williams, letting in Diaz walk. We're going to go through that segment of the offseason. In the second segment, I'm going to grade Pete Alonso walking in free agency. We'll grade the Jorge Polanco signing as well as the Jeff McNeil trade. And then in the final segment, we'll talk about the Kyle Tucker pivot, how the Mets landed the plan of their offseason, and if it saved their offseason to the point where we can actually give this offseason as a whole a letter grade of an A. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've covered the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find some of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Now, this offseason began with a major trade. Brandon Nimmo, the longest tenure Met, gets traded to the Rangers for Marcus Semien. The Mets are also covering $5 million of Nimmo's salary for the upcoming season. He also got $1 million trade assignment bonus. So all told for the upcoming year, when you combine Marcus Semien's $26 million and the $6 million that is going to Brandon Nimmo from the Mets, they're spending $32 million on this transaction for the 2026 season. To theoretically get worse, if you believe Brandon Nimmo is a better player than Semien, no doubt he's a better hitter, but obviously Semien brings you something defensively at second base that Nimmo was not really bringing you in left field anymore. But what this trade was about was the future. And it was about $82 million that the Rangers are going to pay Brandon Nimmo over the 4 years after 2026, compared to the $46 million the Mets owe Marcus Semien after 2026. It's about that flexibility. It's about the fact that this might have been the last chance you had to get Brandon Nimmo's contract off your books. You had to jump through the hurdle of getting Nimmo to waive his no-trade clause, which was not an easy feat. And so when you combine all of that, when you look at the Mets roster now, and you see Carson Bench ready to take over in left field, giving you a fielder that's going to be significantly better as he's a decade younger, who has a chance to potentially, maybe not this upcoming season, but not too long, even surpass Brandon Nimmo out in left field offensively, you start to like the move more and more. And one of the big goals for the Mets this offseason was to get better defensively. And having Marcus Semien up the middle at second base accomplishes that goal. It is a huge move that helped between Marcus Semien and the Luis Robert transaction that we'll talk about later on in the show. Up the middle now with Lindor and Semien at short and second, Luis Robert in center, and Francisco Alvarez behind the dish. That's as good as you can get defensively. And even though there's some question marks in the corners, I think those series of moves made this a good defensive team. So I grade the Brandon Nimmo trade an A. I thought the Mets made a trade that nobody could have seen coming. Nobody expected that Nimmo could actually get traded. And the fact that they got that done and were able to significantly change the makeup of their team with that being the first domino to fall, I think it's an A. I think it's a really good trade. Now, Devin Williams was the next move the Mets made. 3 years, $51 million deal, $15 million deferred, took the present day value of that contract down to $45 million. So it's $15 million per when it comes to the luxury tax. And Devin Williams was one of the hottest relievers on the market. There was a lot of teams that were bidding on his services. To get Devin Williams to sign for a 3-year deal at this value, to me, this is another A, because I look at the Braves. They signed Robert Suarez, who's coming off a better season, but I will trust Devin Williams at 31 years old compared to Suarez at 34. And they basically got the same deal. There was no deferred money for Suarez. It was just 3 years, $45 million. But value-wise, in terms of what the Mets are going to pay on the luxury tax, same deal. I'll take the younger guy in Devin Williams who has given higher peaks throughout his career than we've seen from Robert Suarez. Ryan Helsley got $14 million per over 2 years. You had Raisel Iglesias get $16 million on a one-year deal. Pete Fairbanks got $13 million on a one-year deal. I like the Devin Williams contract more than pretty much all of those. And you got Edwin Diaz, 3 years, $69 million with the Dodgers, but the deferred money takes the present day value of that deal down to more like $63.5 million. I think that Devin Williams over the next 3 years is going to produce more value for the Mets than Edwin Diaz will produce for the Dodgers, because I think these are guys that I believe will have similar production, and you got them at a steal value-wise because you are buying Devin Williams when he was at a relative low compared to the Dodgers who bought Edwin Diaz on, a peak value, or maybe not quite peak because 2022 was arguably his peak value, but still a really great season from Edwin Diaz got him a massive contract. So that leads me to the decision to not give Edwin Diaz a 4th year and to also not give Tyler Rogers that 4th year vesting option. I think not landing one of Edwin Diaz or Tyler Rogers after he got Devin Williams, that to me is an F. It's an F. I talked about this on the show where I went through if there was anything I would do differently about the Mets offseason. And the thing that I said that I would have done differently is how they handled the Edwin Diaz contract negotiations. I don't want to reiterate something that I spent a ton of time on that show, so I do encourage you to go back and listen to it. But for me, the fact that the Mets were so dead set on a 3-year deal, it cost them Edwin Diaz. And they then turn around and did the same thing on Tyler Rogers. I get the aversion to giving a reliever a longer-term deal, giving a reliever 4 years. But you're the New York Mets, and Steve Cohen is your owner, and you can buy yourself out of problems. So if that gets you the guy that's going to make your bullpen that much better, you have to just cave every once in a while on a 4th year. I think if they gave Edwin Diaz the same offer that they put forth, so I can't remember the exact dollar amount, and I don't know the deferral, so it's not even fair to go into. But let's just say they put 4 years, $80 million in front of Edwin Diaz at the beginning of the offseason. I think he signs that contract. And so I think that's a big mistake. And I think not giving Tyler Rogers the vesting 4th year option for a guy that's going to eat 80 innings for you and be available every single day as your setup man, I think that's a mistake. And so that leads to the Luke Weaver contract. In a vacuum, Luke Weaver, 2 years, $22 million. That should be in the B range for a grade, right? That should be a fair value deal for a guy that's been very good in the Yankees bullpen over the last couple of seasons. But when you look at the fact that the Mets wanted Edwin Diaz after Devin Williams, didn't get that deal done. Wanted Tyler Rogers, didn't get that deal done. Wanted Brad Keller at the same dollar amount as Luke Weaver, he chose the Phillies. It kind of says that Luke Weaver was your 4th option to be the second reliever you picked up this offseason. And because of that, I got to drop the grade. Even though I think that Luke Weaver is a solid setup man, I'm dropping it to a C+. Just because I have to dock it a little bit for the fact that it was not what the Mets were aiming for after they signed Devin Williams. It sort of settled on Luke Weaver, which isn't a bad place to settle, but I'm not going to give it a grade anything higher than a C+. Now, before Weaver, the Mets also let Pete Alonso walk. They pivoted to sign Jorge Polanco. And I think after Weaver, but before all of the late movement we saw this offseason, they traded Jeff McNeil. So we're going to go through all those transactions next and give grades to that mid portion of the Mets offseason. Today's episode is brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert start to finish without the stress or the guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with the local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything for you from W-2s to self-employed forms, and they will work to get you every deduction. You can upload documents, go about your day, and you can get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver to give you peace of mind knowing that an expert is handling it for you. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, you just have to file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of getting to 16,000 subscribers by opening day. All right, so let's talk about Pete Alonso. Grading the loss of Pete Alonso. For those of you, again, who listened to that show where I talked about what I would have done differently in the offseason, I came to a conclusion that I didn't expect on that show, and that's that I think the Mets ended up in a really good place post-Alonso. I think that move, or that lack of a move, when it comes to fan sentiment and general PR, it was an F. But as we'll get to in the next segment, when we look at where the Mets lineup ended up after a series of transactions, I think the overall improvements to the lineup, I would grade that more in the A range. So what's the middle ground? A C. And for me, it's just looking at what the Mets are trying to do moving forward and looking at all the different components of their roster. They have Mark Vientos in place, a guy who is an oppressed asset. If they could have traded Mark Vientos and gotten a great piece back, they would have done it. If the Pirates are desperate to play Mark Vientos at third base because they just don't care about defense anymore, and we see a trade that comes across soon where the Mets pick up a really promising young starting pitcher with 5 or 6 years of control, well, all right. The Mets were able to get something of value from Mark Vientos that we weren't expecting, and it's mostly due to the fact that the Pirates are trying to improve their team. They did just sign Marcell Ozuna, and so maybe you line up. But I like that the Mets have not just traded Vientos to trade him. And if you sign Pete Alonso, you'd pretty much be set to play him at first base every day, and clearly they didn't want to do that. The reports are they wanted Pete to DH 5 out of 7 games. So primarily be their DH. And I think very soon into the season, that might have become just an everyday thing. You're the DH. You're no longer playing first base. Are you going to play Mark Vientos at first base every day? I don't think you do that. But you don't get Jorge Polanco if you sign Pete Alonso. You probably don't even get Bo Bichette. So when you look at all of the different things that happened since, you'll also look at the long-term spending. I don't know if the Mets aren't a worse place without Pete Alonso, as much as it pains me to say that, because I love Pete Alonso. I wanted him to play his whole career at the Mets. I wanted to see him chase 500 home runs in a Mets uniform. It's just, unfortunately, not something we'll see, and something that we've had to just absorb and get over as Mets fans. But I look at where the Mets are at, and if you gave me an alternative path where the Mets sign Pete Alonso and they outbid the Yankees on Cody Bellinger, I think I'd take the Mets' current offseason over that one, because while those two teams might be comparable, and maybe the floor is a little bit higher with Alonso and Bellinger, certainly offensively, that team, you'd be stuck. You'd be stuck with that team. If the Mets had a bad season in 2026, you'd be really hurting trying to flip a core. So the Mets decided it was time to move on from the past, and that's why I'm not going to knock that transaction any more than just saying, C. It's almost refusing to grade it. It's just, it is what it is. Now, the Jorge Polanco signing is interesting. I give it a C+, 2 years, $40 million. I don't dislike Jorge Polanco. He's coming off a really good season. He had a 132 WRC plus. That's weighted runs created plus. Measures hitters on a league average of 100. So a 132 WRC plus is a very healthy mark. If you are above 120, you are a very good hitter. If you get beyond 130 in the season, that's a great year for a guy. So he's coming off a really strong season. He played 138 games for a guy that has missed time in the past. So it was good that he was able to get out on the field. He slashed his strikeout rate from 29.2% to 15.6%. He also crushed left-handed pitching, a real problem for the Mets last season. Polanco had an 896 OPS versus lefties and a 153 WRC plus. He also hit 2 home runs off the best left-handed pitcher in baseball, and Terry Skubal, in a playoff game. So I like the bat, and if he is what he was last year, it's great value, even at the $40 million over 2 years. The problem, he's missed 184 games over the previous 3 seasons prior to last year, and he still missed 24 games last year. Never played first base before. Those are things that I'm not going to just ignore. And so while I think Polanco has a chance to have a good season, do I think the Mets could have spent $40 million over the next 2 years in a better way? I honestly do. So I give it a C+. Trading Jeff McNeil and $7.75 million for Yordan Rodriguez. This is an interesting one. I understand why fans are happy that Jeff McNeil is no longer the New York Mets. He could be a frustrating player to watch. And I do appreciate that Brett Beatty is going to fill McNeil's role. And I like that Beatty has that runway to playing time. Still, if we're just grading that trade where you ate $7.75 million, $5.75 for the upcoming season, and $2 million for the buyout on his club option, which theoretically the A's could pick up or they could trade him somewhere where they pick it up. But McNeil would have to have a great season to have that contract picked up for next year. So again, probably $7.75 million for a lottery ticket arm. The Mets did not get better by making that trade, certainly for the upcoming season. If they still had Jeff McNeil, he would far and away be the best left field alternative to Carson Bench, and that'd be a tough competition for Bench to win because Jeff McNeil is still an above-average hitter who plays solid defense in left field. Now, I get the Mets wanting to move on from that past core. I get why they made the trade. I don't think I would go back and not make the deal, but when you just sign MJ Melendez to compete in your left field mix, and there's a chance if Bench isn't ready that it's Brett Beatty playing out of position in left, MJ Melendez, who hasn't been a good defender and has been bad for a couple of years, particularly last season, or it's Tyrone Taylor giving you great defense but not much with the bat. If that's what the net result is when you get to opening day, and you could have just held on to Jeff McNeil for $10 million more on your books for the upcoming season to just have an insurance policy all over the place. Purely baseball-wise, I can't grade that trade anything better than a C-. I just can't, even though I understand it. So as we sort of reflect on the peaks and valleys of the offseason, the Mets offseason started off great. You trade Brandon Nimmo, a task that most of us deemed impossible. You signed Devin Williams, a really good setup man. At least that's how it was advertised at the time, and gave you a fallback option in case Edwin Diaz was wooed by the Dodgers. Okay, not a bad start. But then you come second to the Dodgers on Diaz. You come second to the Blue Jays on Tyler Rogers. You also let Pete Alonso walk and replace him with Jorge Polanco, who's never played first base before. And then when all we've been doing is just sitting on our hands waiting for something to happen, all the Mets have been doing is sitting on their hands, and all we've been doing is waiting for stuff to happen, they salary dump Jeff McNeil and clear him out with no clear answer in left field. At that point in time, the Mets offseason, you probably couldn't have graded it anything better than a C-, a D, an F. Who knows where fans would have graded it at that point in time. But they went on a full-out pursuit of Kyle Tucker, and while they didn't land him, they came up with a plan B after it that was executed flawlessly and completely turned the narrative of this offseason. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now it's time to take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club, and you're going to get Locked On Mets without the interruptions. You get access to our Discord. You can chat with other Mets fans. You'll also get access to a merch shop. If you want to be part of the Everydayer Club, you can find a link in the episode description, or you can go to subtext.com. You can go to lockedonmets.supercast.com to join the Everyday Club. And if you want to be part of our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets, you can ask me questions anytime. That's where you go to lockedonmets.supercast. You can also find a link to that in our episode description as well. Let's talk about the Kyle Tucker pivot. And that pivot was Bo Bichette. 3 years, $126 million deal. I'm grading that one an A-. And the only reason I'm giving him an A- on that grade is because Kyle Tucker was the A+ and this was plan B. So you dock it a couple points, but really, I thought this was an awesome move. Clearly, the dollar amount that he's getting is eye-popping. For the upcoming season, Bo Bichette is going to make $42 million, and if he walks and goes to free agency after the season, you got to pay him a $5 million kicker. as he hits the market. So then you would have paid $47 million for 1 year of Bo Bichette service while giving up the assets that are attached to signing a free agent with a qualifying offer. That is a steep price, but you have secured age 28 for Bo Bichette. And if it doesn't go well, the age 29 season for Bo Bichette. And if that doesn't go well, you get his age 30 season. I think there's a really good chance that one of those 3 years, he is going to be awesome. And it's probably one of the first 2. And so with that, and with the Mets need to add a bat, this move was so good, especially when you think about the alternatives. Cody Bellinger was never coming to the Mets. So what was left? What else could they have done? Pull off a trade for Jarren Duran? Duran hasn't been traded. Who knows what that ask would have been, but it might have been more than what Freddy Peralta netted the Brewers. So that could have been a very tough trade to pull off. Could you have just traded for Luis Robert? Said, all right, we got Brett Beatty at third. We got Jorge Polanco at first. We got Luis Robert in center and Carson Badges in left. We're good to go. You couldn't have done that. You needed a big bat, and you got the best one that was left on the board, and you got him on a short-term commitment, so you weren't tied to him for 10 years or anything crazy. You still have the ability to change up your core. This is very much a win-now season as you're heading into a potential lockout. I think this is the perfect type of deal for, with all of that context in place. Also, the added carrot that could push this to an A+ grade is the fact that you stole him from the Phillies, as they thought he was signed, sealed, and delivered to them on a 7-year deal for $200 million. Instead, you end up pulling Bo Bichette for your division rival, and I think that move gave the Mets a much better chance to win the division. Would Kyle Tucker have made the Mets a more formidable threat to win it all in October? Probably. He's a better player than Bo Bichette. But when it comes to winning the division, you can make a case that because Bichette would have been a Philly had the Mets not swooped in, this was the better move for them to win the NL East. I'm giving it an A-. I could be talked into an A. It was a very good move. And then the next one was trading for Luis Robert. The Mets gave out Luis Acuna and Truman Pauly. Pauly could be an interesting pitcher, but he was not even among the Mets' top at least 6 or 7 pitching prospects in the system. Acuna was out of options, so that made him a little more expendable. And he hasn't proven he can hit at the big league level. Now, I will say, one thing I'm concerned about with this trade is just where the Mets are at their shortstop position in the organization. Between this trade and the Freddy Peralta trade, they gave up the only 2 guys that were in the organization that I could see stepping in and holding down shortstop if Francisco Lindor ever went down. Now, the positive side is you picked up Bo Bichette. So you always could put Bichette back at his natural position of shortstop, play Brett Beatty at third, and that is your backup shortstop for the upcoming season. But long term, that's the one thing about this trade that I don't like, is just the Mets are very thin at the shortstop position now across their organization. With that said, Acuna was not going to get a ton of run this season unless the Mets didn't trade for Marcus Semien and he had a runway at second base. It just wasn't going to happen. And you pick up a guy that has an incredibly high ceiling. And if he reaches that ceiling, Luis Robert becomes the best move the Mets made this offseason, because you can pick up his club option for $20 million. And you got 2 years of a superstar center fielder in his prime at 28 years old. So there is an incredibly high ceiling for this trade. The floor is a guy that crushes lefties and gives you great defense in center field, which is still an upgrade over Tyrone Taylor. But we can't ignore the fact that he is coming off 2 straight seasons with a sub 665 OPS, and his WRC plus has been exactly 84 in each of the last 2 seasons. He has not been a good player for the White Sox since 2023. So I can't just only focus on the upside and say, oh, this is an A, and only focus on the return for the White Sox, which, let's be honest, these are pieces the Mets shouldn't feel too much. Assuming Lindor just stays healthy for the next 5 years, you won't feel it at all, really. So, and for me, I put it somewhere in the middle of the downside that you have to acknowledge, and also the injury risk Luis Robert is. The money that you're spending, there's a lot of stuff that you can say the downside to, but I think the upside outweighs it, and that's why I ultimately give it an above average grade of a B. Last move of the offseason, ignoring Luis Garcia, who we'll talk about when I go through the overall grades for each unit, the lineup, the bullpen, and the rotation. Ignoring that move, the Freddy Peralta trade. Brandon Sproat, Jet Williams for Freddy Peralta and Tobias Myers. This is the A-plus move. This is the best move the Mets made this offseason, even acknowledging the fact that I love Jet Williams as a prospect, and you can go back and listen to the show I did with Aram Layton, was that last week or maybe the week before, where we talked about Jet Williams versus AJ Ewing and why I think that personally I would view Jet Williams as a better prospect. But for the Mets, they really love AJ Ewing. He's a better fit for them long-term in center field. You hold on to him in this trade. But really, I just think the Brewers wanted Jet Williams. And that was, for them, the biggest part of these negotiations. There was a handful of teams bidding on Peralta. It was going to take a lot to get him. And the price to get him was Jet Williams. And the Brewers pretty much never moved off that. So the fact that you pulled off this trade where, yes, you had to give up a lot. Brandon Sproat and Jet Williams over the next 6 seasons, in terms of WAR, are likely going to outdo what the Mets get from Peralta and Tobias Myers. If you're just looking at the upcoming season of Peralta and the next 5 years of Myers that you traded for. The thing is, the Mets, in my opinion, will extend Freddy Peralta, which immediately makes this trade a win because you had an inside track to locking him up long-term, and you now have an ace, and you needed an ace. And the fact that you were able to pry Tobias Myers from the Brewers, and you get an arm that can slide into your bullpen immediately, but also gives you rotation depth for the upcoming season and beyond, and you have 5 years of Myers, it's an A+ for me. And that's coming from a guy that really likes Sproat and really liked Jet Williams, but this team needed an ace, and they got one in Freddy Peralta, and they got another very useful arm in Tobias Myers. So as we look at everything put together, the revamped starting lineup, the Mets no longer have Brandon Nimmo, Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil, and Starling Marte, but they have added Marcus Semien, Jorge Polanco, Bo Bichette, and Luis Robert. Defensively, the Mets got better. Bichette at third base and Polanco at first are certainly risks, but Semien and Robert at the middle is outstanding defensively, and you go through that list of Nimmo, Alonso, McNeil, Marte. The only plus defender there is Jeff McNeil, and that's simply because of his versatility. The Mets picked up 2 plus defenders in Semien and Robert. A guy in Polanco that I do think is probably going to be better at first base than Pete Alonso, just because he's a better athlete. He's going to be able to throw the ball to a pitcher, and he's a former shortstop. Typically, when guys have that past track record, they can make the transition to first. This is not the same thing as Moneyball, where it was, what was Chris Pratt? Who was the real catcher? Oh, that's going to bother me. I do not want to look it up, but it's bad. And everyone who's watching knows they're screaming it to themselves. They're saying, how does he not remember? I'm going to have to take the L on this one. And I'm mad about it, but it is what it is. Let's without further ado, show how wrong I was. Who does he play again? Scott Hadenberg. Oh, that's just brutal. If I had a fine bucket, I'd find myself on that. But this isn't a former catcher moving over to first base. It's an infielder. So I do think that Polanco is going to be better defensively than Pete Alonso. I think Bichette will be better than Mark Vientos was over at third base. So I look at the defense. I think the Mets really improved in a meaningful way. They have way more long-term flexibility. The only guy that is on the books for 3 years guaranteed is Semien. Bichette could be, but likely not. And then Polanco and Roberts, 2-year commitments at most. I think the Mets got better. I think offensively, it's close to a wash. If you want to give a slight edge to Nimmo, Alonso, McNeil, and Marte compared to Semien, Polanco, Bichette, Robert, you could. I'm not going to fight you on it, but overall production, I think the revamped starting lineup and just the new look and the new feel that clubhouse is going to have, I'm giving it an A. I really like what they came up with. The only hole on this team right now is left field, potentially. And you have one of the top prospects in baseball ready to take that leap, and I think he's going to handle it well. So then, to me, that plugs that up. And I mean, I guess theoretically, if Luis Robert doesn't hit, that becomes a hole, but he's still better than what you had. And I think even looking at the upside they have at DH of Mark Vientos, I'm even looking forward to seeing what that looks like for the Mets. So again, overall lineup, I'm giving it an A. The Peralta move, I already gave it an A+, but just how they address their rotation, I'm still calling that an A+, because I like that they did not get too reactionary and sell low on Kodai Senga or David Peterson. They haven't just traded those guys to trade them so that they could sign somebody else. I actually like that they kept their group together, and all they needed was an ace to knock everybody down a peg, and now Nolan McLean is one of the best number twos in Major League Baseball. David Peterson and Clay Holmes give you a middle of the rotation that I feel really strong about. I think that that's going to be a very steady group in the middle. And you got the upside in the back end with Minaya and Senga. You also held on to Jonah Tong, and Tobias Myers can factor into your rotation mix as well, where I think that Myers in function really does replace Brandon Sproat well as far as the 2026 Mets. Over the next 6 years, Brandon Sproat, I would bet on him being a better pitcher than Myers. But for the upcoming season, I don't know how much better Sproat would be in his first full tour across the big leagues, where Myers is entering his third season, getting significant time in the big leagues. So overall, I grade the rotation an A+ as far as what the Mets did to address it, because they got Freddy Peralta. The bullpen turnover for me, I'm calling that a C+. I don't think it's bad, but I don't think it's that great either. Devin Williams and Luke Weaver in a vacuum, not bad additions. But you lose Edwin Diaz and Tyler Rogers, and I think you got worse there. And Luis Garcia, well, I think if I was to grade that specific move, it'd be like a B or something. For $1.75 million, it's hard to knock picking up a reliever that throws as hard as Garcia does and has much success as Garcia did at the end of last season. But, I mean, look, you lose Ryan Stanek. He was awful last season. Just based on the volatility of relievers, could Ryan Stanek turn in a better season than Luis Garcia this year? Yes. And yes, you added Tobias Myers, which I do think helps his bullpen a lot. But I just feel like they dropped the ball on either having the incredible 1-2 punch of Edwin Diaz and Devin Williams, or getting a guy in Tyler Rogers that is just so incredibly valuable in that setup role of just being available so much. Luke Weaver can do some of that, and he has pitched a lot of innings. He certainly did in 2024. But I just feel like this bullpen's missing a little something. And they might find that something in spring training, because there is a lot of non-roster invites, which is what we're going to talk about on tomorrow's show. We're going to go through all the non-roster invites as spring training will officially open up on Wednesday. So that is your show for tomorrow. But before we close the show for today, I got to give this total offseason a grade. Did the Mets do enough in the 11th hour to turn a C, D, or an F offseason, depending on how mad you are and how attached you were to the Mets of the past? And did they flip it all the way around and make it an A? I come just short of that. When I grade the Mets offseason, the more I really think about it and think about each move and how everything stacked up together, I give it a B+, because I definitely understand why the Mets wanted to move on from that past core, and I'm looking forward to turning the page and seeing what this new group can do. I think they did get better defensively. They got their ace, which was a huge part of their offseason, and they were able to, I think, get back to a similar baseline offensively while giving you some new faces and plenty of upside to believe in. Betting on a bounce back for Simeon or Luis Robert. I did a whole show on that. I think there is a chance that either or both of them could be a much better version of themselves and give you what we saw from both of them in 2023. Maybe not all the way there, but if they get back to 80% of their 2023 seasons, those guys, I mean, that's going to be a huge addition to this team. So I like how much ceiling they have baked into this roster with some of these riskier moves that can pay off in a massive way. I love that they got an ace, but the way that they address their bullpen docks the grade a little bit. And also, we just can't ignore how much money it took to get this done, where it's fair to contemplate and wonder what else they might have been able to pull off with this amount of resources that they ended up allocating to this offseason. They went from, we're going to keep the budget to about the same, to just blowing through that and spending a ton to sort of course correct after a rough middle portion of the offseason. And I don't think we can just ignore that middle portion and say, all right, it's an A, because what we were left with was a greater lasting impact, because that series of transactions in that 1 week of picking up Bichette, trading for Robert, and then trading for Peralta was so awesome. It's the last thing that we remember. And so it just sort of makes us natural say, oh, this was an A off season. I'm going to go just short of that. I think it was a B+. But I do like where this team's at. And I think they are ready to compete in this division and ready to compete in the National League. And they very well could have had an A+ offseason, because we'll never truly know how good an offseason was until you play the actual season. So I could have given them a C. I could have given them a D. I could have given them an F. Doesn't really matter, because what all that actually will matter is what actually happens once we get to first pitch and opening day happens and real baseball games are being played. Guess what? We are so very close. Pitchers and catchers official report tomorrow, even though it seems like most of the Mets team is already there. I'm going to break down all of the non-roster invites, and we'll also probably do, some early spring training storylines to follow. So you'll have a kind of a spring training primer for tomorrow's show. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. I also encourage you to follow Locked On Mets on our social media platforms. We have a new intern that is doing a ton of great work. So you're going to see some more TikToks. If you want to go over there, you'll see YouTube shorts. You'll see an Instagram account that's starting to get some action, more tweets going out on Twitter or X. So we are definitely increasing the output on all these different platforms. And I do ask and encourage you all to follow along for all things Mets. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.